The audit was scheduled for 0900, Hegemony Standard Time, which translated to about 11 in the morning by the clock on my wall. The one I'd brought from Earth and refused to take down, partly because I liked knowing what time it actually was, and partly because it annoyed Logistics Superintendent Vretha Khan to no measurable end. He arrived 7 minutes early. They always do, the crustacean caste administrators. Punctuality is a dominance display for them. Arriving before schedule communicates that they have already assessed the situation, have already formed their conclusions, and are simply waiting for the inferior party to catch up. Vretha Khan had 4 subordinates with him, 2 junior auditors in the pale gray tunics of the Hegemony Accounting Corps, one who appeared to be a scribe, and one who I suspected was there purely to carry a case and look severe. They were all tall, all armored across the shoulder carapace in the overlapping ridged plates that the senior crustacean bureaucrats wore as a mark of rank, and they all smelled faintly of the ammonia salt, compound the species secretes when it's feeling confident. I could tell by the smell alone that this was going to be a long morning. My name is Delia Marsh, and I have been the quartermaster of Coalition Joint Waystation Catharafor for 11 years. Before that, I spent 8 years as a supply specialist aboard 3 different vessels, 2 of them military, one of them a disaster relief transport that taught me more about actual logistics than any posting I've had before or since. I am not a soldier. I am not a diplomat. I am the person who makes sure there is food, water, breathable atmosphere, fuel, and medical supplies on a station that sits at the junction of 6 major transit lanes and supports, on any given rotation, somewhere between 400 and 900 personnel of 11 different species. I am very good at my job. I have been very good at my job for a long time, through postings that ranged from comfortable to genuinely difficult, through supply chains that worked and supply chains that didn't, through commanders who understood logistics and commanders who thought logistics was the business of counting boxes, which it is, but only in the way that surgery is the business of cutting. The counting is the surface. The judgment is the work. Vretha Khan was about to spend several hours concluding the opposite. He came through the supply office door with the particular kind of slow, deliberate stride that in crustacean body language signals what loosely translates as tolerant inspection of a lesser establishment. His 2 primary eyes, the large forward-facing pair, not the smaller lateral ones that tracked motion, swept the room with the flat, incurious look of a customs official going through bags he already knows contain nothing worth taxing. His carapace plates shifted with a dry, papery sound. His mouth parts, the forward-hinged secondary ones the species uses for fine articulation, made a small precise motion that their translator rendered into standard as Quartermaster Marsh. I am Superintendent Vretha Khan of the 7th Hegemony Accounting Corps, attached to the Coalition Joint Logistics Oversight Bureau. We are here to conduct the biannual supply audit as mandated under the Cathara Accords, Article 14, Section 3. Please have your manifests ready. They're already on the table, I said. He looked at the table. The manifests were on it, 6 binders, organized by category, flagged with color-coded tabs, alongside a running digital inventory on a tablet synced to the station's storeroom sensors. I had been ready since 7:30. I'd also made coffee because I drink coffee, and the pot was sitting on the counter behind me. Vretha Khan's lateral eyes, the small ones, flicked briefly to the coffee pot. He said nothing about it. He took a seat. His subordinates arranged themselves around the table with the precision of people who have done this together many times. The scribe produced a data slate. The one carrying the case set it down and opened it, revealing a second set of binders that I recognized as Hegemony Standard Issue Supply Benchmarks, the official reference tables against which human coalition stations were assessed. They were thick. They were color-coded in a different scheme than mine. Vretha Khan opened the first of my manifests. He was quiet for about 40 seconds, which for a crustacean caste administrator means he was reading very carefully. Then one of his anterior limb joints, the small flexible one above the primary wrist, made a brief clicking sound. It wasn't translated. In crustacean social signals, that click is involuntary. It happens when something registers as unexpected. Not alarming, not threatening, just unexpected in the way that a child's drawing is unexpected when you open what you thought was a professional portfolio. He turned to page 2. I refilled my coffee. Quartermaster Marsh, he said without looking up. Your caloric stockpile for the protein category. These figures are recorded in, he paused, checking the header, kilograms. That's right. And the shelf life notation here. He indicated a column of numbers along the right margin. This is rendered in what unit? Years, I said. Another pause. The junior auditor on his left leaned over to look at the same column. They exchanged a glance. In crustacean body language, a shared glance between colleagues during an inspection is the equivalent of two humans catching each other's eye and very briefly raising their eyebrows. The professional version of that is meant to be invisible. They weren't quite managing invisible. These figures indicate, Vrethakon said slowly, as if he was being careful to account for the possibility of translation error, that your protein reserves have a projected shelf life of. He did the mental arithmetic, or perhaps he had a calculator somewhere in his carapace. I was never sure, between 3 and 25 years. Depending on the category. Depending on the category, I agreed. He set the binder down with the controlled deliberateness of someone placing a piece of evidence on a table. That is irregular. It's standard practice, I said. Most of it's got to do with the preservation method. You want me to walk you through it? I believe I understand preservation methods, Vrethakon said, and the mouthparts made a tiny motion that the translator did not render but which I had learned, over 11 years, to read as faint amusement held carefully in check. It was the expression an expert makes when a novice offers to explain something elementary. What I am attempting to understand is why a coalition joint facility is relying on preservation techniques that he consulted the hegemony standard benchmark binder, turning to a specific tabbed section with practiced efficiency. Predate, in several documented cases, the station's own construction date by a significant margin. Some of the methods do go back a ways, I said. The annotation here refers to a process called. He consulted the page again, and the translator stumbled slightly, the way it always does with terms that don't exist in hegemony taxonomy, curing, of a protein described as another pause, pork belly. That's right. Bacon, said the junior auditor on the left, apparently reading ahead. He said it the way you say a word in a foreign language when you're not sure you're pronouncing it right. That's the end product, I said. Vrethakon's lateral eyes made a small sweep of the room that I read as reassessing whether the conversation was still worth having in good faith. He decided it was. The curing process as annotated here involves salt, time, and, he checked again, smoke. Mostly yes. And the hegemony benchmark for protein preservation, he said, with the tone of a man who has arrived at the useful comparison. As established under the Coalition Supply Harmonization Agreement, Protocol 7, subsection Alimentary and Nutritional Reserves, mandates vacuum-sealed thermal-neutral packaging in food-grade polymer sheeting with active molecular inhibitors to prevent cellular degradation, at a minimum storage standard of. I know what Protocol 7 says, I said. We're grandfathered. Article 14 of the Cathara Accords specifically preserves the right of coalition members to employ traditional food security methods provided they meet nutritional minimums and safety standards, which ours do. Page 46 of the compliance section. I've marked it. He found page 46. He read it. He turned to page 47 to confirm the continuation. He put the binder down again. Grandfathered, he said. Grandfathered, I agreed. There was a silence that lasted about 6 seconds. The scribe was writing. I could not see what the scribe was writing, but given the general trajectory of the morning, I suspected it was not complimentary. Vretha moved to the second binder, dry goods and grain, and the process repeated itself, with variations. There was a column of notations in handwriting, not typed, because I annotate by hand when the items require context that the automated system doesn't capture cleanly, and Vretha slowed when he encountered this, as if my handwriting were a small personal offense against the concept of records. There was a category labeled Preserved Vegetables, Traditional Fermentation, see Processing Notes, that produced another shared glance between the two junior auditors, this one slightly less invisible than the last. There was a section on grain stores that had been triple-checked by my staff and was, I knew, arithmetically correct to a degree that would survive any challenge. And there was a section on what I called contingency dry goods, which included, among other things, 47 kilograms of rolled oats, 600 individual packets of something called instant noodles, and a quantity of dried lentils sufficient to feed the station's entire population for approximately 3 weeks. Vretha looked at the lentils notation for a long time. These legumes, he said. Lentils, I said. They require, he checked my processing notes, only water and heat for preparation. That's right. No specialized equipment. A pot helps. You don't technically need one. He looked up at me then, fully, with both the forward-facing primary eyes and the lateral ones, which is a crustacean signal for giving something one's complete and serious attention. I met his gaze and did not say anything further. I had learned that filling silences in these inspections is never to your advantage. Quartermaster Marsh, he said, I'm going to note in my report that the coalition facility at Cathara 4 maintains supply practices that are, in several categories, significantly below the technical sophistication mandated by coalition harmonization protocols, and that while certain exemptions apply under grandfathering provisions, the overall standard represents. He chose his words with the care of someone who is trying to be accurate while also being diplomatically cutting. A marked divergence from modern logistics methodology. You're welcome to note whatever's accurate, I said. He made the small mouthparts motion again. Practical functionality, he added almost as an afterthought, is not in dispute. Your nutritional minimums are met. Your safety records are adequate. This is, as I said, a matter of methodology. Noted, I said. He closed the second binder. He had 4 more to go. By the time they reached the water reclamation and atmospheric compound section, the junior auditors had stopped being invisible about their reactions and had progressed to a state I can only describe as quietly entertained. One of them, the one on the right, younger, with the smaller carapace plates of a recently promoted officer, had at some point produced a personal notation device and was transcribing things that I strongly suspected had nothing to do with the official audit. I couldn't see his screen, but the angle of his attention whenever I said something like, the dehydration ratio holds for up to 30 years under standard storage conditions, or we find paper labels more reliable in high humidity environments, suggested he was collecting material for a story he intended to tell later. I didn't mind. I'd been the story before. Vretha, to his credit, remained professional throughout. He was precise, he was thorough, and he was scrupulously fair in applying the compliance provisions. He found 2 minor discrepancies in my cold storage temperature logs, both within acceptable variance, but noted, and 1 labeling inconsistency in the medical supply section that he recorded without comment. He did not editorialize again after that first conversation about the lentils. He didn't need to. The audit itself said everything he wanted said. They took 4.5 hours. At the end, Vretha gathered his materials, nodded at me with the formal tilt of a senior administrator acknowledging a completed interaction, and told me that the preliminary findings would be transmitted to the Coalition Joint Logistics Oversight Bureau within 3 standard days. His subordinates filed out behind him. The one with the notation device glanced back once before he cleared the door. The young ones always do. I drank the last of my coffee, which was cold. Then I went back to work. The preliminary findings arrived in 2 days, not 3. They were, as promised, thorough. The report ran to 68 pages, which for a standard supply audit is approximately 42 pages longer than necessary. And about halfway through, I understood that the extra length was not due to diligence so much as it was due to a fairly detailed section titled Comparative Assessment. Cathara 4 Supply Methods versus Hegemony Standard Logistics Protocol, which read, in the dry precision of official hegemony bureaucratic prose, like a carefully documented expression of disbelief. It compared our protein preservation methods to pre-industrial food security practices with narrow applicability in modern multi-species contexts. It described our grain storage as volumetrically dense but methodologically antiquated. It referred to the lentils specifically by name, which I thought was a nice touch, in a footnote that characterized them as a calorie delivery mechanism of notably limited versatility. The footnote had a sub-footnote, which cited 3 separate hegemony nutritional standards, documents that the lentils technically satisfied while apparently doing so in a way that the drafters of those documents had never envisioned and possibly would have been troubled by if they had. I read the whole thing. I forwarded the relevant compliance sections to my staff with the notation for filing. I sent a 1-paragraph acknowledgement to the Logistics Oversight Bureau confirming receipt. I did not respond to the comparative assessment section because the comparative assessment section was not requesting a response and would not have benefited from one. Then I filed the report and I went on doing my job, and 6 weeks passed. The hegemony resupply convoy that served the Cathara corridor ran on a 42-day cycle. It was not a remarkable convoy, 4 mid-class transport vessels, a hegemony logistics coordinator aboard the lead ship, and a standard manifest of processed ration units, technical components, and the particular type of atmospheric compound that several crustacean cast and scale skin species require in their breathing mix. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was reliable, and reliability in the resupply business is the only currency that actually matters. It didn't arrive. The first I heard of it was a priority message from the station's traffic coordination office, flagged routine urgent, which is the classification that means something is wrong but not yet badly wrong. The convoy had missed its check-in at the previous waypoint. That happened occasionally: drive fluctuations, navigation corrections, bureaucratic delays at origin, and missing one check-in was not cause for alarm. It was cause for attention. I put my staff on a quiet inventory review. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would register to the population of the station as a signal to be concerned about. Just a clean, detailed picture of exactly what we had and where we had it. The convoy missed its second check, 2 days later. At that point it became a coalition coordination matter, and I was briefed, along with the station's commander, a hegemony liaison officer named Pelath, and a representative from the Transit Authority, in the station's secondary situation room. A space that had a long table, several screens, and a persistent faint smell of the gas. The scaleskin species exhales that the ventilation system had never quite managed to eliminate. Commander Yale Sorrento, who had been running Cathara 4 for 9 years and who I had worked with for all of them, sat at the head of the table with the patient expression of someone who has encountered bad situations before and has learned that panicking is mostly a waste of time that could be spent thinking. She was a compact woman in her late 50s, with close-cropped gray hair and the habit of tapping a single finger on the table when she was processing information. She was tapping. Liaison Officer Pelath was a different matter. He was a crustacean, mid-rank carapace, seconded from the same bureau that had sent Vretha Khan. He was not Vretha Khan. Vretha Khan had moved on to audit other stations, but he had clearly been briefed on Kethara 4, because the way he looked at me when I entered the room suggested he had read the 68-page report and formed opinions. He had the particular posture of a crustacean official who is worried but does not want to appear worried, which in their species registers as excessive stillness. He was very still. The Transit Authority representative was a tall, one of the elongated pale gray species, a head and a half above everyone else at the table, named Assessor Yuvrath, who was attending because 3 of the 4 missing ships were registered to the Transit Authority's Common Carrier Division, and who had the detached professional calm of someone whose entire job consists of expensive things going wrong. "Current best estimate on the convoy," Commander Sorrento said, to no one in particular, though she was looking at me. "Gone," said Assessor Yuvrath without notable emotion. "Drive failure, navigation error, or hostile action. Given the corridor they were traveling, drive failure is statistically most probable. Timeline for replacement convoy. Standard hegemony resupply staging," Pelath said, "is 30 to 40 days from incident declaration to convoy dispatch. Given the current allocation cycle," he reviewed something on his data slate, 60 days is more probable. Sorrento nodded once, tapped her finger. "Marsh." "We're fine," I said. Pelath's stillness broke, just slightly. One of the anterior limb joints made a very small motion that wasn't quite the involuntary confidence click I'd heard in my supply office. This one was sharper, shorter, closer to what translated as reflexive doubt. "You are," he started. "I ran inventory last night," I said. "Full station population at current rotation is 612. Combined food stores across all categories, accounting for the full spectrum of species-specific dietary requirements, will sustain that population for," I checked my notes, though I didn't need to, 83 days at standard ration levels. Adjusted for lean ration protocols, which the station can implement without significant crew impact, that extends to 112 days. There was a pause. "Your stores," Pelath said carefully, "include the," he seemed to be searching for a term that was not dismissive and settling for technical, traditional preservation products. "They do," I said. Another pause, different in character from the first. The first pause had been the silence of disbelief, encountering a confident number. The second pause was the silence of a man recalculating something he had previously dismissed. 83 days, Assessor Yuvrath said, not to anyone in particular. "At standard rations," I said, 112 on lean protocols. "The hegemony crew component," Pelath said, and here his voice shifted, just slightly, into a tone I recognized. "Official concern entering its professional register, maintains dietary requirements under hegemony nutritional standards. The ration units aboard the convoy were specifically formulated. I have compatible stores for approximately 40 of your crew," I said. "The remainder will need to eat what we've got. I have the full nutritional breakdown in the compliance section of our supply manifest. If you'd like to confirm compatibility, it's on page 46, the section that was assessed as grandfathered in the recent audit. All the nutritional minimums are met. It was, as I recall, documented." Pelath was quite still again. 60 days is more probable," Sorrento said, quoting his own estimate back to him. "We have 83 at standard, more on lean, we're fine." She stopped tapping. "I'd like daily inventory reports, Marsh." "You'll have them," I said. She stood, which ended the meeting. Assessor Yuvrath collected their things with the efficient sorrow of someone who would now have to file a great deal of paperwork. Pelath remained seated for a moment after the others began to move, looking at a middle distance that appeared to contain the memory of a 68-page audit report, its comparative assessment section, and all 37 footnotes. I gathered my notes and went back to work. The next 10 days were, from my perspective, mostly logistical. I met with my staff 6 humans, 2 tall, 1 scaleskin named Verath who had the remarkable ability to be simultaneously pessimistic about everything and effective at everything, and a young hegemony caste crustacean named Kelvath who was on a cross-species exchange posting, and who was, without question, the most enthusiastic person I had ever worked with in any professional context. I outlined our inventory position, explained the lean ration protocols, and assigned tracking responsibilities. Kelvath was assigned to monitor the hegemony crew's dietary needs, because he was ideally positioned to communicate in terms they'd trust, and because he had the combination of cultural literacy and personal investment. He was on our station, eating our food, embedded in our operation, that made him a genuinely useful bridge. He also took notes on everything, in the small, precise handwriting of his caste, and had been doing so since he arrived 4 months earlier. I sometimes suspected he was already writing the report he intended to submit at the end of his exchange posting, and that the report was going to be interesting. The station settled into the measured cadence of managed scarcity, which is a particular state that logistics people know well and most everyone else finds difficult at first. The instinct, when supplies become finite and the resupply timeline is uncertain, is to hoard, individually, by unit, by species. I had seen it on the disaster relief ship and twice in my years at Cathara 4, during supply disruptions of lesser scope, and the pattern was always the same. People became tribal about food in ways they didn't expect of themselves. The antidote was transparency and routine. I published the full inventory figures, updated daily, to a screen in the station's common areas. Everyone could see exactly what we had, exactly what we were consuming, and exactly where we stood against the projected resupply window. Numbers are steadying when people can read them. Mystery is what breeds panic. The hegemony crew, 41 personnel in total, a mixed-rank contingent that managed the transit coordination systems that Cathara 4 technically hosted on behalf of the hegemony, had their own reaction to the situation, which was more complicated. For the first 3 days they consumed their personal reserve rations, which were standard hegemony issue. Dense, nutritionally complete, odorless, and packaged in the vacuum-sealed thermal-neutral polymer sheeting that Vretha Khan's report had praised as methodologically sophisticated. These ran out on day 4, because personal reserves are not designed for sustained station-wide rationing. They're designed for emergencies of a few days' duration, not 2 months. On day 5, Liaison Officer Peleth came to my office. He arrived at 0900, which I recognized as an intentional choice. He stood in the doorway for a moment, making the assessment sweep with his primary and lateral eyes. I was at my desk, working on the daily inventory report. The coffee pot was on the counter behind me. My earth clock said 10 after 9. "Quartermaster Marsh," he said. "Superintendent," I started, and then corrected myself because Peleth was a liaison officer, not a superintendent. "Liaison Officer Peleth, what can I do for you?" He sat down across from my desk. In crustacean social practice, sitting without being invited to sit is a statement. It says that the person sitting has determined that the conversation warrants the posture of equals, or at least near equals, rather than the standing formal interaction of a superior and subordinate. Peleth sat. I noted it without comment. "My crew," he said, "requires guidance on the available provisions." "Of course," I said, "I can have Kelvath walk them through the options." "I would prefer to receive that guidance directly," Peleth said, "from you." I set down my stylus. "Now, if it's convenient." I stood up. "The galley is 2 levels down," I said. "Follow me." We walked. Peleth's carapace plates made their dry sound with each step, a rhythm I had come to find oddly companionable over the preceding days. We took the central access corridor, the wide one, which runs the full length of the station's habitation ring, and which, at 10 in the morning, had a moderate amount of foot traffic. Shift changes, maintenance crews, a few off-rotation personnel heading to or from the common areas. Several people nodded to me. A few looked at Pelath with the neutral curiosity that the station's population directed at hegemony personnel generally. Not unfriendly, just aware of the distinctions. The galley was warm and smelled of something I had put on the steam table that morning. A lentil soup with dried herbs and a good deal of black pepper, because pepper keeps indefinitely, and I have opinions about under-seasoned food. There was also a tray of flatbread that one of my galley staff had been making since before my shift started, and a large pot of the oat porridge that I had offered at every breakfast since the lean ration protocol went into effect, plain or with dried fruit, depending on whether you were managing your sugar intake. Pelath stood in the galley entrance for a moment. "This is prepared from your traditional stores," he said. It was not quite a question. "The lentil soup is lentils, water, dried onion, and spices from our contingency stores. The bread is flour, water, salt, and baking powder. The oats are oats." He made no response to that. He walked to the steam table and stood in front of the soup pot. I handed him a sample in a small cup, which is what I do when I want someone to try something without committing to it. He looked at the cup. He looked at me. He drank it. His lateral eyes made a small, rapid sweep that I had come to recognize in my 3 days of closer proximity to hegemony personnel than usual, as the expression their species makes when they encounter a sensory experience that doesn't match any existing reference category. They couldn't file the information because there was no folder for it. "It is," he paused, "warm." "Yes," I said. "And the flavor is complex. Lentils have a mild earthiness. The pepper adds heat. The dried onion adds sweetness that comes out in cooking. It's a common combination." He was quiet. He looked at the soup. "In hegemony provision standards," he said, "complexity of flavor is not a primary assessment criterion." "I know," I said. He accepted a full serving. He sat at a table in the corner of the galley, the corner that got good light, with a view of the corridor through the window, the standard choice of a person who is accustomed to keeping their back against a wall in unfamiliar environments, and he ate. I did not watch him eat, because nobody likes that. I went back to the steam table and began ladling out servings for the morning crew change rush, which was starting to filter through the galley door. I had a conversation with my galley chief about the afternoon's menu, a grain and preserved vegetable dish that Verath had grumpily but accurately described as nutritious in a way that makes no promises. And I dealt with a query from Kelvath about whether the flatbread recipe could be scaled up for a larger batch without losing the texture, which it could. By the time I looked back at the corner table, Pelath had finished his soup and was holding the cup in both primary hands, looking at it with the expression I had last seen on his face when he was considering the inventory figures in the situation room. The expression of a person who has encountered an honest number and is adjusting their model. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. On the third morning, he brought 2 of his crew with him, a junior coordinator and a technical officer whose name I didn't catch the first time but who I later learned was called Tessonville. They sat at the corner table, all 3 of them, with their bowls of porridge and their cups of the strong dark tea I had started brewing in the galnings when I noticed that the crustacean cast personnel responded well to hot liquids with a bitter edge. Something in their chemistry, Kelvath explained, that mapped loosely to what caffeine does for humans. By the end of the first week, the corner table was full every morning. By the end of the second week, it wasn't just the corner table. 41 hegemony personnel, integrating into the galley routine that my staff had run for 11 years, is not a small operational adjustment. It required recalibrating the portion schedule, working out which items sat well with crustacean digestive chemistry, and having a frank conversation with Kelvath about how to explain to his colleagues that the bread, while unfamiliar, was not structurally different in any meaningful way from their own dried starch provisions, and would not, despite its lack of polymer packaging, poison anyone. He handled it well. He had the natural talent of someone who had been quietly observing cross-species dynamics for months and had built up a vocabulary of small bridges. Kelvath, for his part, turned out to have a useful combination of qualities that I hadn't fully appreciated until the crisis gave me a reason to look. He was meticulous. He was bilingual in the particular way that only someone who has genuinely absorbed a second culture can be, and he was, underneath the precision of his crustacean caste formality, curious about everything. He followed me into the storage rooms. He watched my galley staff work. He asked questions, careful, specific questions, the kind that come from someone who is not performing interest but actually has it, about why certain preservation methods worked and others didn't, about what caloric density meant in practical terms, about why humans used salt in so many different ways, and what the chemistry of each one was doing. He had clearly been filing all of this away since his exchange posting began, and the supply crisis had given his note-taking a focus, and a purpose that I suspected was going to produce something interesting. "The smoke," he said to me, on day 11, watching my galley chief slice the cured pork belly for a morning protein portion. "When you introduced smoke to the preservation process, you were introducing combustion byproducts to the protein surface." "That's one way to put it," I said. "And those byproducts," he checked his notes, "act as antimicrobial agents in addition to the moisture reduction effect. The salt handles most of the moisture. The smoke helps with surface contamination. Together they create conditions where spoilage organisms can't establish. Time does the rest." Kelvath made a careful notation. "In hegemony preservation methodology," he said, "we use active molecular inhibitors, engineered compounds introduced post-packaging, calibrated to the specific protein's cellular chemistry. Precise. Effective." "Also effective," I said, "different approach." "The inhibitor compounds," he said carefully, "require manufacturing infrastructure, supply chain, calibration equipment, specific storage conditions for the compounds themselves." "Right," I said. He made another notation. He didn't say anything else about it, and I didn't push him. But I noticed, over the next several days, that his questions shifted, from how the methods worked to why they had persisted, what conditions had generated them, what the selection pressure was that had made them standard practice across dozens of different human cultures in dozens of different historical contexts. It was the question that a logistics engineer asks when they stop looking at a system as primitive and start looking at it as a solution to a problem they hadn't previously understood. The thing about communal cooking as a logistical mechanism is that it is extraordinarily efficient when the population it serves allows it to be. Hegemony standard provisions are individually packaged and individually consumed. By design, there's a whole protocol about it, touching on contamination prevention, species-specific calibration, and something about personal dietary sovereignty that I had read once in a compliance document, and found interesting in the particular way that very earnest bureaucratic documents are interesting when you've been doing the practical version of the work for 20 years. Individual packaging is fine when you have an unlimited supply chain and no need to make the most of finite resources. When you're managing a station for 83 days on what you've got in the hold, communal cooking is 3 times more efficient, less waste, better caloric utilization, more equitable distribution across the population. It is also, as a secondary effect, the kind of activity that tends to reduce the psychological strain of a difficult situation in ways that are hard to quantify, but that any experienced quartermaster can see. People eat together. They talk. The food becomes a reference point, something shared, something that takes effort and produces results and has a smell and a warmth. The lentil soup, which I had been making variations of for 11 years, became a daily constant. The flatbread improved as the galley staff scaled the recipe and learned what they were doing at volume. The oat porridge acquired a following among the off-shift maintenance crews that surprised me slightly, though in retrospect it shouldn't have. It's filling, it's warm, it's consistent, and consistency matters when other things are uncertain. Around day 14, something else happened that I hadn't planned for but recognized when I saw it. The galley, which had always been a functional space, a place where people ate and left, began to function as something more like a common room. People lingered. Shift workers who had eaten together came back for tea an hour later and stayed to talk. The hegemony technical officer Tessonville, who had initially approached the provisioning situation with the tight formal bearing of someone who considers visible discomfort a professional liability, was observed on day 16 sitting at a table with 3 of my maintenance crew, all of them eating oat porridge, having a conversation about atmospheric recycler efficiency that my chief maintenance officer, Rodrigo Vargas, later characterized to me as actually pretty good. Vargas has a high bar for actually pretty good, so I took note of it. It was the bread, I think, more than anything else. Bread is a simple thing, but it has a particular quality, the warmth of it, the smell of it baking, the way it needs to be pulled apart rather than cut when it comes fresh from the oven, that seems to register in species with hands, regardless of what those hands look like or how many joints they have. On day 17, one of the hegemony junior coordinators asked my galley chief how it was made. He showed her. She made a loaf, somewhat imperfectly, and ate it. On day 18, she brought a colleague. By day 20, Kelvath had quietly added bread-making practicum to his list of cross-cultural exchange observations, which he told me with a gravity that suggested he considered it as significant as anything else he had recorded. I didn't disagree. You can quantify a lot of things about a supply crisis: caloric intake, nutritional compliance, consumption rate against reserves, projected duration. You can measure morale only indirectly through proxies: sick call rates, incident reports, maintenance error frequency, the general temper of the people you pass in the corridors. Hours stayed throughout the 58 days within the range of a station that is inconvenienced but functional. I believe the galley had something to do with that, in the same way that I believe a clean, well-labeled storeroom has something to do with a quartermaster's sanity. It's not the only factor, but you feel the difference when it's present. Peleth said nothing to me directly about any of this for most of the second week. He ate, he observed. He came to the morning brief that Commander Sorrento ran daily, where I presented the inventory numbers, and he listened to the numbers with the careful attention of someone who is checking them against an internal model and finding that the model needs no adjustment. The numbers were tracking correctly. We were well inside the buffer. Peleth said nothing to me directly about any of this for most of the second week. He ate. He observed. He came to the morning brief that Commander Sorrento ran daily, where I presented the inventory numbers, and he listened to the numbers with the careful attention of someone who is checking them against an internal model and finding that the model needs no adjustment. The numbers were tracking correctly. We were well inside the buffer. What he did do, and I noticed it because it was consistent and because I noticed patterns, was arrive at the galley early. Not before the galley opened. That would have been conspicuous, but early enough to have his choice of table, and to be settled with his food before the main rush came through. In crustacean social practice, arriving before others to claim a position is an assertion of status. Arriving early to a human galley during a supply crisis to eat lentil soup before the morning crowd, that's a different thing. That's a decision made privately without an audience, which means it isn't status. It's preference. I didn't remark on it, but I noticed. On day 19, a message came through from the Hegemony Logistics Oversight Bureau, the same bureau that had produced Vrethakon, the 68-page report, and the footnote about the lentils. The message was addressed to Liaison Officer Peleth, with a courtesy copy to Commander Sorrento, and in what I suspected was bureaucratic thoroughness rather than any personal intention to me. It was a status update on the replacement convoy, 60 days from incident declaration, as projected. Possibly 70, due to an allocation conflict at the staging depot. Sorrento read it at the morning brief. She said nothing, tapped once, looked at me. "We're at day 19, I said. "Stores tracking as projected, no variance." "Good," she said. Peleth, across the table, was looking at the space between us in the particular way that meant he was thinking about something he had not yet decided to say. I gave him time to decide. "The hegemony crew's dietary adaptation," he said, eventually, "has proceeded without significant incident." "It has," I said. "I would not have predicted that," he said. It was said carefully, in the tone of someone making a factual statement about themselves that they find somewhat uncomfortable but consider accurate. My preliminary assessment before the rationing period began was that integration with, he chose the next word with notable care, traditional provisions would present a significant management challenge, a morale impact. I communicated that to the Bureau in my initial report. "I remember," Sorrento said, "and I appreciated the economy of that." "I will be submitting a revised assessment," Peleth said. Neither Sorrento nor I said anything in response to that. We didn't need to. Peleth made no further comment on the subject, and we moved on to the maintenance schedule, which had its own set of issues involving an environmental control panel on level 6 that was being held together partly by competent engineering, and partly by the kind of improvised cable and bracket solution that my maintenance chief Rodrigo Vargas described as fine as long as nobody looks at it directly. The revised assessment, as it happened, was not a thing I saw until later. Peleth was not required to share it with station staff, and he didn't. I learned of it in the way I learned most things that happened in the administrative layers above my pay grade. Eventually, indirectly, when someone mentioned it in a context where it became relevant. What I heard was that the document was notable for its precision, and for a specific passage in which Peleth characterized the Cathara 4 supply methodology as operationally resilient in adverse conditions, to a degree not reflected in compliance benchmark assessments, and noted that provisions classified as methodologically antiquated in the prior audit report demonstrated practical utility that warrants reassessment of the benchmark criteria. He apparently cited the lentils in that passage as well, by name. In the main body of the report, not a footnote. I did not respond to this information in any particular way when I heard it. It was accurate, which is the main thing I ask of official documents. The convoy arrived on day 58, 2 days ahead of the revised schedule. It was a larger convoy than the standard one, 5 ships rather than 4, with supplementary stores to compensate for the deficit period and a manifest that I read through twice, because the second pass told me something the first pass hadn't fully registered. What I noticed on the second read was not what was there but what had been decided to put there. The decision itself, and what it implied about the person who'd made it. There were several 100 kilograms of bulk legumes, a category I had never previously received from a hegemony convoy, because the hegemony's standard provision system doesn't deal in bulk legumes. There were multi-kilogram blocks of salt and what the manifest labeled dehydrated aromatics, mixed variety, culinary grade. There were whole grains, listed without a processing standard notation, which in logistics shorthand means someone had ordered them without quite knowing how to classify them. I signed for all of it. My staff logged it. Kelvath, reviewing the manifest over my shoulder, made a small note in his personal notation device. He had been making notes throughout the entire 58 days in that small, precise handwriting, and by this point the notation device was nearly full. The hegemony resupply coordinator who came with the convoy was a mid-rank logistics officer named Ivash, who had a list to check off, and was doing so with the brisk efficiency of someone who has a schedule to keep. He came through the supply office doing the standard intake process, checking my receiving documentation against his dispatch manifest, noting the station's storage conditions with a quick automated scan. He was professional and efficient and gave no sign of finding anything remarkable about the situation until he reached the section of the intake inspection that covered existing stores, the residual inventory that a station carries over after a resupply, which logistics coordinators log to establish a baseline for the next cycle. Avash scanned the existing inventory. He read the numbers. He checked them against what he had presumably been briefed to expect, some significant drawdown of reserves, a station that had been running close to its limits for nearly 60 days. The numbers were not significantly drawn down. We had managed the drawdown carefully. The reserves were in reasonable shape. The inventory I presented to him looked, in the summary columns, quite a lot like the inventory I had presented to Vrethakan 6 weeks before the convoy went missing. Avash looked at the inventory summary. He looked at it for a long moment, in the way that people look at things when the thing they're seeing doesn't match the thing they expected to see. "Your stores," he said. "These figures are post-rationing period." "They are," I said. He looked at the numbers again. 58 days at full station population. 612 personnel, yes, I said. We adjusted a few times as the population shifted. We had a crew rotation on day 30, but the figures are accurate. "And you," he started, and then seemed to recalibrate his question. "What was your primary protein source during the deficit period?" "We cycled through our preserved stocks," I said. "Cured product, dried legumes, grain-based preparations. We had some supplemental protein from our hydroponic section, though that was a small contribution. It's mostly herbs and a few leafy things. We're not a large-scale agricultural operation. But the preserved stores carried the bulk of it." Avash was quiet for a moment. "The cured product," he said. "This is the annotated items here, the pork belly." "Bacon," said one of my staff from across the room. "That's right," I said. Avash made a notation in his intake log. He did not comment further on it. He completed the intake inspection with the same brisk efficiency, signed off on the delivery, and handed me his copy of the receiving documentation. He was clearly a thorough professional who kept his personal reactions out of his official conduct, which I respected. At the door, he paused. He was not quite the same as the junior auditor who had glanced back 11 weeks earlier, but the gesture was recognizable. "Quartermaster Marsh," he said, "I've read the audit report from the station." "Vrethakan's, the 68-pager. "Yes," a pause, "and Peleth's revised assessment." "I haven't read that one fully," I said, which was true. I'd heard the key passage, but not the whole document. "It's thorough," Avash said. He said it with the careful neutrality of a man who means more than he's saying and is choosing not to say more, which is, in my experience, the most interesting kind of man to work with. You'll likely receive a request from the Logistics Harmonization Bureau at some point, regarding methodology. "I'll answer whatever they ask," I said. He nodded. He left. I looked at the supplementary stores that his convoy had delivered. The bulk legumes, the salt, the dehydrated aromatics, mixed variety, culinary grade. Someone, somewhere in the chain between Peleth's revised assessment and this convoy's manifest, had made a decision about what to add to the standard Kethara 4 resupply load. Had sat with the Hegemony Logistics Oversight Bureau's databases, with their vacuum-sealed polymer packaging and their active molecular inhibitors and their methodologically sophisticated provision standards, and had looked at 58 days of numbers and decided that the Kethara 4 supply methodology was worth understanding from the inside. I stacked the legumes in the dry goods section next to my existing lentils, my handwriting on the label, the shelf life noted in years. I stood in the storage room for a moment after I labeled them, which is something I don't usually do. The room was cool and dry and quiet, and it smelled of the particular clean earthiness of bulk grain and dried legumes, which is one of my favorite smells and has been since the early years when I first understood that a full storeroom is the most honest kind of security there is. You can't argue with a full storeroom. It either holds what it needs to hold, or it doesn't. Ours did. Someone at the Logistics Harmonization Bureau had added these items to a hegemony resupply manifest. That wasn't a small thing. Manifests are generated algorithmically, adjusted only through formal protocol revision. Adding bulk legumes meant that somewhere in the chain, in Pelath's revised assessment, in Kelvath's meticulous notes, in some combination of them working on the same cautious official mind, a person had looked at 58 days of operational data and decided the thing worth understanding was not the crisis but the method. Not why the situation hadn't been worse, but why the stores had held up the way they had, and whether that was worth replicating. It was a modest conclusion, reached quietly through channels without drama, which is how the useful ones usually arrive. Then I went to make a pot of coffee, because it had been a long morning, and I have always found that the best time to think is the few minutes when the water's heating, and there's nothing to do but wait. Kelvath found me in the supply office about an hour later. He had the expression that he wore when he had finished something, a completeness in his posture that I'd learned to read as a specific form of crustacean caste satisfaction, different from pride and different from relief, closer to the feeling of having done something carefully and found that it held. "I've finished my exchange posting notes," he said. "I've compiled them into a formal report for the Hegemony Cross-Species Exchange Program." He paused. "I wanted you to be aware of the content before I submitted it." "Am I going to be alarmed?" "No," he said, "but you may be cited frequently." "As what?" He consulted his notation device. "I've been working on the terminology," he said, with the careful deliberateness of someone who has thought hard about a specific word choice. "The Bureau's language for what you do here uses traditional and antiquated and pre-industrial. I found these insufficient. I've used intrinsic resilience methodology instead." I considered that. "That's not bad," I said. "I've also cited the lentils," he said, "extensively." "They've become a recurring item," I observed. "They're an excellent example," he said, with what I had come to understand was, for Kelvath, the highest form of enthusiasm. "They require no specialized equipment. They have a practical shelf life that exceeds the duration of most foreseeable supply disruptions. They satisfy nutritional requirements across 7 of the 11 species present on this station. They cost almost nothing. They scale without loss of quality. And they are," he checked his notes, "consistently well received." "They are," I said. He made one more notation. "I've recommended that the exchange program consider Cathara 4 as a priority posting for future participants. I've described it as an environment with significant instructional value regarding practical logistics under constrained conditions." "I'll take that as a compliment," I said. "It was intended as one," Kelvath said, with the gravity of someone who does not give compliments lightly and wants that to be clearly understood. He submitted his report the following day. I know because he told me, and because the response from the Hegemony Cross-Species Exchange Coordinator arrived within 48 hours, unusually fast, in my experience, for any kind of official response. Noting that the report had been received and flagging it for review by the Logistics Harmonization Bureau at their quarterly meeting. I also know, though not until several months later, that when the Logistics Harmonization Bureau convened its quarterly meeting, Kelvath's report was presented alongside Pelath's revised assessment, and a third document that I had not been told about, which was a memo from Superintendent Vrethakhan himself, the original auditor, the one with the 68-page report and the footnote about the lentils, submitting a voluntary addendum to his own prior findings. I heard about it from Commander Sorrento, who heard about it from someone in the coalition administrative layer who had been at the bureau meeting and found it noteworthy. The addendum, apparently, was brief, 4 paragraphs, where the original had been 68 pages. It acknowledged the Cathara 4 deficit period and the outcome. It noted that the supply methodology under review had performed at a level that the prior assessment did not adequately model. It observed, in language that Sorrento described to me as extremely dry for a hegemony document, which is saying something, that the shelf life figures originally notated in my manifest, the ones that Vrethakon had questioned during the audit, the 3 to 25 years across categories, had proven, under operational conditions, to be accurate. The last paragraph, as Sorrento related to me, consisted of a single sentence recommending that the benchmark criteria for the relevant categories be reviewed in light of the deficit period data. Sorrento told me all of this in my supply office, on a morning not much different from any other morning, in the matter-of-fact tone she uses when she's conveying information she thinks is worth having. The coffee was on. The earth clock said 8:15. Outside in the corridor I could hear the early shift traffic picking up, the ordinary sound of the station running its ordinary routines. He sent it voluntarily, Sorrento said. Vrethakon. I heard, I said. Nobody asked him to correct his own report. No, I said. She looked at me with the expression she has when she's waiting to see if I have anything to add. I am familiar with this expression. We have worked together for 11 years. I refilled my coffee. I've got the daily inventory report to finish, I said. Right, she said. She stood up. At the door she paused. They always pause at the door, the interesting ones, and said, "Lentils holding up." Full compliment, I said. Good for another 4 years minimum. She left. I went back to my inventory report, which was accurate down to the kilogram, because it always is, and which showed, as it had shown every day of the deficit period and every day since, that the station was fine. We were fine. We had always been likely to be fine. The supplies were what they were, practical, resilient, quietly effective in the way that things are when they have been refined over a long time by people who needed them to work and didn't have the luxury of being wrong. What the audit report had called primitive methodology was, when you looked at it from inside a supply crisis, another way of saying that it had been tested by harder conditions than anyone in the Logistics Harmonization Bureau had apparently thought to model. The benchmark criteria review, as it happened, took about a year. I know because I was asked to submit operational data as supporting documentation, which I did, one comprehensive document, appendices included, organized by category, flagged with color-coded tabs. I did not annotate it in handwriting as a courtesy. The resulting revised standards included, for the first time in the Hegemony Coalition Harmonization Protocol, a provision recognizing traditional preservation methods as compliant with modern supply requirements, provided that nutritional minimums were satisfied and operational effectiveness was demonstrated. There was a footnote referencing Cathara 4. I did not frame it because I am not that kind of person. I have never kept citations or commendations on my walls, not the ones I've earned, not the ones that arrived unexpectedly, not the ones that came dressed up as footnotes in hegemony protocol documents. The work doesn't need decoration. The storeroom either holds what it needs to hold, or it doesn't. I did read it.